Awesome. Thank you so much, Kendra. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me here. I'm excited. I actually just did a presentation for Partners Resource Network, which is in Texas, is our PTI in Texas, and they're wonderful folks as well. So I appreciate this opportunity. And again, thank you, Kendra, for reaching out. I'm glad I could do this. So she gave a little bit of background on me, and so I won't rehash the information because I love to have time for questions after we go through this. But I do want to give you a little bit of context just so you kind of understand where this presentation came from, because it really, I think is important. So, my colleague and I, we do a lot of different services. I'm a certified rehab counselor, have been for years. And one of the services we do, so I always tell people, if you kind of think of our services, you can kind of put them into three buckets, right? So one of those buckets is placement. So we actually help people with disabilities get jobs in their community, competitive integrative employment. So that's our placement bucket. The second bucket is training. So we actually provide pre-employment transition skills training or pre-employment training skills to individuals with disabilities 14 to 22. We do this actually in Texas, Nevada, and in Wyoming. And so that's one of the services, and that's the one service that I'm primarily involved with. But we also do, as part of that training, it's kind of its own thing, but we also do what's called Campus Connections, which is a college support program at schools in Texas and Nevada as well. And then probably that third bucket, which is evaluation. And that's really where this presentation comes from, is that third bucket. So with evaluation, one of the things that I tell people is we're brought in frequently by attorneys, school districts, VR agencies, trying to think, parents directly, private pay sometimes, that's pretty rare, but sometimes that happens too. And we're brought in as an outside evaluator to do a functional vocational evaluation or a functional transitional evaluation. And basically the whole, whole meaning of that, and less fancy words, is just coming in and giving, doing testing and an assessment, and then giving a set of recommendations relating to somebody's vocational capacity for the future. So if you're an individual with a disability, should you go to college? Should you go into a job first? Should you go into a college and then a job? What kind of college degree or training should you get? All those different things. So we use assessments and evidence and data to make those recommendations for families. And that's a service we do all over the country. We've not done any in Virginia as of yet. We have done some in New York, Connecticut, Iowa, Texas, California, Nevada, missing one. Florida. That was the other one I was missing, Florida. So we do them all over the country. And some of them, you could imagine with COVID, we've done some of it virtually, but we obviously prefer to do most of that in person. You can just get a lot more good data in terms of observational data and student interviews. A lot of our clients do respond a little bit better in person. So that's definitely the preference. But in doing those evaluations, and we've been doing them now for about, trying to think, I've been doing them for about 12 years. No, wait. Yeah, 13 now. Now, as of this year, 13 years. My colleague, Bruce Bloom, has been doing them for about 15 years. And we kept seeing over and over and over again, we saw these similarities coming up about individuals in IEP meetings. We kept seeing these same 10 issues, okay? And so him and I were at a conference and we were looking at, hey, we want to do a new presentation that really focuses on what we've been learning doing these evaluations across the country. And this is what was born out of it. Is we said, let's take these 10 things that we see, and we wrote them down literally at dinner at a restaurant at a conference, of course, pre-COVID, different days. But we wrote all these things down and we decided, hey, let's go ahead and make a presentation just based on this information. And so that is what you're seeing. I hope it's as helpful to you as it has been to us. We still do a lot of these evaluations. We have a bit of a wait list for it right now, believe it or not, just because of, as you can imagine, there's not a lot of folks that do the kind of work we do. But we love doing them, and we still see these things over and over, although I tell you kind of some trends we've noticed too with COVID that'll be interesting, I think, to hear. So that said, I'm going to jump right in. One last thing before I go forward. At the bottom of the slide is our website. If you need to contact me, if you have questions about what we do, please visit our website. There's a contact form on there that you can send us an email. Those usually get routed to me and my staff, and we can, whether it's something I need to answer or another staff member, I can get you the right person. And also do my email at the end as well. So you can feel free to reach out to us to learn more about what we do or get in touch. So that said, we're going to jump forward. So let's look at the first mistake. So when we're looking at transition and IEP documents, and we're coming in as that what we call IEE, Independent Educational Evaluator, we're coming in, and this is probably one of the most common things we see. The goals are too broad. So the individual has a goal. And so I do want to preface this at the bottom of each of these slides. You'll see an example. And that example, we've changed the name of the person for obvious reasons of confidentiality, but it's a real goal. These are things we really found in IEPs and transition plans. So Bob will go to college when he graduates. Now, that is a great goal. There's nothing wrong with that goal. It's a wonderful goal. The problem is it's just a bit too broad, right? Because this particular individual was, I believe, about 14, and he still had, several more years and several more steps that needed to be taken between where he was and going to college. Great goal, but far, far, far too vague. We needed some really intermediate and kind of action steps, if you will, between where he is now and where he was wanting to go, right? So the goal was a little bit too broad. So sometimes we need to we need to really get into the nitty gritty and really break that down into, probably in this case, the student really needed 3 or 4 at least specific goals before going to this kind of bigger, broader goal. So that's one thing we see. The other thing we see, though, is that goals are too specific. So a lot of times when we're looking at goal development in an IEP team, or in Texas, we call them ARDs, it's the same thing. We see that goals are even too specific. So this is an example, and I could not make this up because it's a really dumb one in my opinion. But it's Bob will not wear blue clothing more than 3 days a week. Okay, it's a real goal. I cannot make that up, not if I tried. So it's really important to think about the fact that with this individual, if you had any context, which I'll give you a little bit, he was an individual that was high functioning on the autism spectrum, had a lot of ability in terms of some knowledge and intellectual capacity, but really, really struggled with some of his social skills and independent living and ADLs, activities of daily living. And so for him not wearing blue clothing was by far the least of his problems. He had so many more things to work on that were so much more important than the color of the clothes that he wore. And while I will acknowledge he did wear blue every time I met him. It's not a bad color though, so I guess it can work. But that wasn't really the issue. The issue was he just had much bigger fish to fry. So we have to be careful that we don't swing to that other extreme. And we don't go to, hey, let's focus and nitpick every little minute detail and try to make this student or change this student to make them what we want them to be. That's not really what those goals should be about either. We really need to shoot for that middle ground, which is we have specific enough information to set some intermediate steps to get to that big goal. And that's what we're really shooting for. That's what we're trying to see happen. But again, I see this both directions in a lot of these, and I've seen this across the country, certainly not just in Texas or not just in California. These are things we see everywhere. So the other thing that we see is goals discount the actual functioning of a student. And so, I always tell people, I am not someone that's going to tell you, it doesn't matter what the student wants or the family wants. Not at all. A family or a student's hopes and dreams and interests should always be considered in the transition planning process, always. The key that I'm saying, though, is they can't be considered in isolation without acknowledging the realities of that individual, meaning what are their current academic, physical, mental, or intellectual functioning and capacity. The reason that this becomes really important is because we may be setting up a student to fail if we're not really looking at the whole student in terms of their functioning and how they're doing. Great example, and actually I have 2 I want to give, but this first one is Bob wants to be a heart surgeon, but he's a 3rd grade reading level and would most likely never be able to pass the MCAT to get admitted to medical school. That's not a fact. That's not my opinion. At a 3rd grade reading level, you're not going to be able to probably read most of the questions on the MCAT. I could barely pass it. I probably couldn't pass it, in fact. So that's not really an opinion. That's more of a factual statement. And the bummer is that if they went forward with this goal and we weren't involved and we didn't work with them on this goal and get it sharpened to what it should have been, which I'll explain in a second, they would be literally setting the student up to fail. And we don't want that, not as educators, not as parents. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to help our students find success. And so I'll give you some context to this. This individual comes to find out, we do the evaluation with him, and what we really find out is it's not that he wants to be a heart surgeon. What it is he Googled heart surgeon, and he Googled a couple of medical terms and found heart surgeon. And in Google, it had a lab coat. The heart surgeon was wearing a lab coat, and he really wants to wear a lab coat. So after we talked to him, it wasn't really that he wanted to be a heart surgeon. It's that he wanted to wear a lab coat. Well, guess what? Medical technicians, there's all kinds of other people that are not even doctors that wear lab coats in a medical setting. Totally fine. Pharmacy, all kinds of different things. So it wasn't really that he wanted to be a heart surgeon. He just wanted to wear a lab coat. And there are lots of other goals we could address, and we did. We gave him a lot of options that were within his capacity, that he thinks that he could do, that were medically related, where he could get to wear that lab coat. So that's one example. The other example I'll give is physical limitations. It's not always even just intellectual or reading level. Physical limitations. My colleague, Bruce Bloom, who's the company's named after, who's my co-evaluator, does a lot. He actually has taken over most of our evaluations with the other work I do. And Bruce had a client who he wanted to be an anesthesiologist. This individual who wanted to be an anesthesiologist was in a wheelchair. And if you know anything about anesthesiology, and I can never say that word 3 times fast, so don't test me. I can always mess it up in the middle. But if you know anything about that particular job, the main thing you do, as we call the essential functions is the term we use of that job, is you are over a patient physically, usually kind of on top of them or kind of to the side of them, and you're administering that particular, drug or cocktail, whatever they're being used to sedate them, and you have to physically do that. So this individual, even with all the really cool technology we have out there, and we do have some really cool technology, especially with wheelchairs and other things, him physically being able to do that job was going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible to do. And so it was a physical limitation. It's not something that even with the best accommodations, we could really work out and get him to be as functional as the typical person, anesthesiologist without a disability. And that was going to be the problem. Same thing now. This individual, it wasn't really that he wanted to be an anesthesiologist. He wanted to work in a hospital. Well, again, there's a million jobs in a hospital you could do. Some of them in which being in a wheelchair is no problem whatsoever. So it's not that he was looking in the wrong workplace. He was just looking at the wrong position. So it's really something we need to look at is we want to acknowledge a family's hopes and dreams, and same with the student, but we need to do so, I'm just going to say realistically, with common sense of where are they at as an individual, their functional capacity, physically, mentally, academically, intellectually, reading, doesn't matter. But are we really looking at the holistic student? And I'll tell you, this is the one that I see it just as much now as I did when I wrote this presentation years ago. And it's something that I still see so much frustration and problems caused, because we'll talk to schools and schools will say, well, we can't tell them they can't do that. Why can't you tell them that? They can pick it, but why can't you be honest with them? So your solution is, we can't tell them, so we're just not going to say anything. Then the student's going to have a career goal that they really can't achieve. Then they're going to try to go for it. They're going to fail. And then they're going to be what? Somebody else's problem, or their parents are going to have to deal with them and their failure and all those issues. No, so that's not going to work. We have to have those honest conversations. And a lot of times when we're coming in to do an evaluation, Bruce and I like to say that a lot of times we're not saying anything no one's ever thought. We're just the only people saying it. And we're the first person to say it. And I'm not going to lie, I don't really like doing that. And I don't like being that person, and neither does Bruce, but it's also our job. And it's something that, if we're being honest and right by the client, then that's what we want to do. Mistake 4, goals focus solely on academics. So this can be a tricky one sometimes too, because when we look at academics, a lot of times what I see with schools, and again, I see this across the country, not just one state, not just one area, but I feel like a lot of schools really focus with IDEA on just academics, right? They just focus on that post-secondary education or even just secondary education. And a lot of us know why that is. It has to do with standardized testing, how schools are measured. There's a lot of reasons there. I'm not going to go into that. But the issue is by doing so, we're leaving out 2 really important areas that students have to address if they're going to be functional and live either independent or even just semi-independent and employed in some capacity, even if they're living with their parents. And that is post-secondary employment, independent living. We have to start addressing those. And that the law says that we have to. It's not an optional thing. I don't really know why schools do that. That's something I've never really been able to understand, is how they can kind of ignore that part of the law and that seems to be okay. It's not okay. IDEA talks about not just academics, it talks about post-secondary employment, independent living. It mentions it in the preamble, it mentions it throughout the document at different points. Some of the reauthorizations even strengthen some of that language. So we really have to think about that it's not just about academics. I get that that's what a lot of schools want to focus on, but as parents, especially talking to a group like I am today, that doesn't have to be what you only focus on. You absolutely have every right to bring in discussions about post-secondary employment and independent living into a trend, and especially in a transitional R, but frankly, even earlier than that. So that has to be a big piece of it as well, as we're having those conversations. So this is a real example, and actually a really sad situation for a lot of reasons, but some of what I'll go into, some of which I won't. But Bob is 17 years old. He has a goal of successfully answering 7 out of 10 algebra problems correctly, but his mother dresses and bathes him every day. That's great that we're concerned about his algebra skills, but I can tell you, same deal with the previous Bob. So much bigger fish to fry, so many more important things in terms of functionality. And I want you to really, if you get nothing from my presentation tonight, think about functional skills, right? What's functional? Not just what looks good on paper, not just what the school says looks good or what they want to do or what they are measured on. What's functional? How are we going to make this individual a functional, independent adult who's employed in some capacity, right? That's what we need to look at. And so this individual, algebra was the least of his problems. Why are we focusing on those goals when literally he doesn't have very, very, very basic self-care skills? Self-care skills, by the way, that are had by students that are half his age. Right? Why are we not having that conversation? So important. But guys, I see this all the time, literally all the time. I see constantly where we're focusing on this one particular area, and we're just kind of ignoring this huge elephant that's in the room. I also want to take this opportunity to talk about the last sentence I have on my slide in my title paragraph, which is IQ is not always a predictor of success. And I think it's important that we look at this from both sides of it. So I have seen many times, too many to even count, individuals who are high functioning intellectually, who took AP classes, advanced classes, dual credit classes, you name it, very, very high functioning academically, who absolutely struggle to maintain and obtain a job because of social skills issues or independent living skills issues. So, this, for some reason, and I don't know when this myth got started, but it is a myth that I'm happy to bust and explain, is IQ is not a predictor of success. Smart people are not always successful. I promise you, if you really think about it, I'm sure you know some people that are very intelligent that are not all that successful. It's because there isn't a connection there. That's a fake thing that we think is connected. Not really. Now, I know some successful people that have high IQs, but I also know a ton of them that do not, that are not successful. So IQ, having a high IQ is not a guarantee of success. If that individual or that student doesn't have some basic independent living skills, some basic soft skills for it to be employed, they're going to struggle to be successful. They may not be successful. And it didn't really matter that they took AP classes. It didn't really matter that they, got good grades. Because frankly, I don't know about you guys, I've hired a lot of people in my current capacity at my job. I've never once asked anybody how many AP classes they took or what their grades were, because I don't care. And neither does any other employer. So we really have to be realistic that that's not really an employer expectation. That's a kind of a school expectation, and they're very different. I want to swing the other way though. What about individuals who are low functioning, individuals that have intellectual disabilities, right? They have a low IQ, so they're probably not going to be successful. That's not true at all. I've had people tell me that. I've had parents say that. Not true at all. Actually, I would tell you in our years, we've probably been placing people with disabilities in jobs for almost 15 years now. In those 15 years, I can tell you hands down, the easiest population for my staff and I to place are people with intellectual disabilities. They are some of the best employees we've ever placed. Our employers love them. They work successfully. They maintain the job for years, sometimes decades. So absolutely not true. I have seen some of our individuals that have a lower IQ be far more successful than our high functioning guys on the spectrum in terms of social skills and ability. And so we really need to be careful that we're not applying this kind of myth to either side of the spectrum in terms of intellectual functioning, because I've seen it be proven wrong over and over again for the last 15 years. So really, really important to look at that and not overvalue one or the other. Let's go the right way. Let's try that. There we go. Goals disregard the student's local job market. This can be a really tricky one. And I know Virginia has some rural areas as well, so you guys can understand this. And Texas certainly is no mistake. Nevada is probably even more so. We've got some large cities, but then we've got a lot of really small towns with very limited job opportunity. And so a great example I give is we have a town in East Texas. We did an evaluation of a student in that district, very small district. And there's 2 employers in that town. Actually, I think there's only like 2 employers in the whole county, but we'll say at least that town. And those 2 employers were the chicken plucking farm, where yes, you plucked in like slaughtered chickens because that was a chicken farm. That's what they do. And then the other option was you could work at the gas station, but the gas station only had 1 clerk on duty at all times. And there was usually 2 shifts a day. So basically 2 people a day could work there. And that's it. That was what they had to offer for jobs in that particular town. Okay. And keep in mind, this was before virtual work and a lot of that was even thought about. So, I mean, there was very limited opportunity here. Well, the issue is when I'm evaluating a student there versus when I'm evaluating a student in Houston or Austin or San Antonio or Dallas, one of our larger cities in Texas, or even any other larger city, the job market, if you will, is frankly just vastly different. There are opportunities available in these larger areas that are just not available in these small towns. They're just not there. Those jobs don't exist in that area. So we really have to think about that. And a lot of times we see goals on a transition or IEP plan that are great goals, but they're not really good for where the student intends to execute that goal. Now, I have worked with students that have the ability to move and go across the country. An example I give is I worked with an individual who was going to University of Texas at Austin, one of our large schools here in Austin. He was getting a computer science degree in a specific type of computer science. And he could move. The high functioning, very much capable of taking care of himself. That was not his weakness. Social skills were a struggle for him, but independent living, he was fine. So he moved. He literally picked up and moved. He graduated. He moved to Virginia. Actually, I think he's in Fairfax, Virginia. Funny enough, and went to work with this government contractor that does this specific type of computer coding. And that's great, because that was really the only opportunity in Texas. You couldn't really find a job that did that type of coding, which is surprising, but believe me, it's so specific. He tried to explain it to me and I could never understand it. So it gives you an idea. And I'm a pretty smart person, but he was way over my head. So that's an example where, yeah, he could move to the job market he needed to move to, but a lot of our students can't, whether it's limited resources, finances, family support, you name it. They can't move across the state or across the country to go to that job market where their job is. So are we really, when we're writing those goals, are we looking at what job market the student lives in? And are we looking at where they're willing to move to or able to move to? And is it feasible that they can obtain a position with their training or degree? A great example I see, Bob is a BA in history because it's his hobby, which I love history, by the way, it's kind of my hobby too, but he doesn't want to teach. So the challenge we're going to deal with that is, what do you do with a BA in history when you don't want to teach? Well, pretty much nothing. You don't have a lot of options. You could either go on and get your master's, try to get into research, try to get into like some type of museum or some type of history related research or studies. But at least you got to have a master's to do that, if not a PhD. So that bachelor's is just really a stepping stone. You're not really going to get much jobs with that. It's a bachelor's. That's about all it's good for, is checking that box on an application. So that's something we have to think about as well, is are we getting a degree or training that actually leads us towards whatever that career outcome is? And I think it's very interesting. I see this constantly, to be fair, not just with people with disabilities or students, but also with students without disabilities, is we go to college for the sake of going to college. That's not why we go to college. We're supposed to be going to college because it's a career training opportunity to lead us to a career. So a lot of times I see us go backwards, where instead of planning with the end in mind, we like go to the school and then say, oh, well, we'll figure it out. That's not really how we should be doing this experiment that we call life. What would be ideal is if we were planning on a career goal and then working backwards and figuring out where we need to go to get from where we are to where that career goal is. And that's exactly what our vocational evaluations do. That's exactly what my staff and I do. So that's something to really look at in terms of the job market, and how important and influential it can be. Mistake 6, goals are not student-centered. So they're based on suggestion or influence from others, but they're not necessarily a student's informed choice. So if you're not familiar with rehab counseling, our field has a kind of a core of ethics, if you will. And one of those tenets that I really believe so much in fact, it's one of the reasons why I really fell in love with the field that I'm in and I really enjoy being a part of it, is because we believe in informed choice. And what informed choice is, it's exactly what it says: information to make a choice, right? So what that means is we don't tell students on evaluations, you should do this or you must do this. What we say is, here's your options. Here's what you've told us. Here's the likelihood of those options being successful. You now take this information and select the one that you want. That's informed choice. And so I'm a big believer in informed choice. And the key, though, is it's not parents' informed choice, it's students' informed choice. So students need to be making those decisions about their future. And sure, they can do it with support from family, with information from family. That's what any good student would do. But it's a student's informed choice. So an example here, Bob's parents want him to be an accountant because it pays well and his dad's an accountant. So they send him to school, to college for that, but he skips class due to lack of interest and doesn't pass anyways. In fact, this individual ended up playing video games in his dorm room for pretty much his whole freshman year. Obviously didn't get very good grades because of that. Ended up failing, going back home. And actually that's kind of where we got brought in to do an evaluation. So I don't know where he ended up, but I know where he was. And anyways, this can be a huge concern as well. So is it really the student's choice? Is the student making those decisions? And if not, how are we engaging the student, or how are we trying to engage the student? I get that some students are super verbal, some are not. That's fine. It's important to understand engagement does not have to be a verbal conversation. I've had students that are very engaged, but do so with limited verbal skills. That's fine. But is the student really making that goal? Is it their goal, or is it the parent's goal? Or is it even just maybe it was an influence from a friend? A friend said, hey, you should be this. And then they just went with that. That's not informed choice. So that can be an issue. 7, goals not based upon vocational evaluation. Evidence-based functional vocational evaluation was either not conducted, or if it was not done by staff who lack appropriate certification, licensure, and training. So I tell you, it's in addition to my current job, I also work as an adjunct professor in both graduate and undergraduate education programs. And as a teacher educator who works in these programs, I can tell you it is so frustrating to me because across the country, and I'm pretty sure this is the case of Virginia, although if I'm wrong, great. I haven't been yet, but we asked transition educators, special ed teachers across the country to do transition plans and write transition IEPs. But we asked them to do it with no training in their teacher program, with no coursework in their teacher program. And then we wonder why it's not what we want. Well, we didn't train them. So they're doing the best they can with what we didn't give them. And I see that all the time. I see parents that get frustrated with teachers. I see parents that get frustrated with case managers and IEP teams. But I always go back to, but they don't know what they don't know. And they didn't go to school in this. I did. I teach teacher educators. In Texas, at least I can speak for us here. I work in a school in Iowa, and I know they're the same way. There's no coursework on transition, zero. So it's usually thrown into another course that the teachers take during their teacher preparation training, and that's it. And so they're getting a paragraph at most, and that's not enough information to do transition well. It's just not. So I always tell people, I tell them, and parents too, don't get mad at the teachers. They're doing the best they can with what they have. Get frustrated and upset at the system or their administrators who are asking them to do something that they're not trained, certified, or licensed to do. And for some reason, we do that in transition, and I don't know why. No one's ever been able to answer that question for me. When we get a heart transplant, we're crazy because we insist on a heart surgeon. But yet, when we get transition, anybody can do that. I don't know why we do that. I don't have an answer to that. I've never gotten an answer. It's definitely not in the research either. So I don't know who decided that or when that became okay, but it's not okay. And it's not, like I said, not the teacher's fault. You don't know what you don't know and what you've not been trained or taught to do. So that's a huge thing we see. And we sometimes will see in a school district, they'll do some good transition assessment, but they don't know how to interpret it. They don't know how to take what the test said and actually make it applicable to the student in terms of selecting college, selecting a job. That's where there's that lack of connection. Mistake 8, insufficient connection to adult services. So the connection to adult services providers agency was either not provided, or if it was, they weren't really educated. So a lot of times what we see is parents will be told, well, here's the number to vocational rehabilitation. Call them. Here's the number to the agency that does Medicaid waiver services and Medicaid funded services in our state. Go call them. Here's the wait list. Get on that. Here's da-da-da. Well, the problem is when we don't tell parents, and this is where organizations like PT or in Texas Partners or the other every state has some type of PTI. This is where PTI organization can be amazingly helpful because they can help educate parents on these things, and they're tremendous resources for us. And I've lost count of how many times we've referred parents to PTIs like in different states that we work with. And so it's a huge benefit because they can answer some of these questions. But a lot of times we have to ask ourselves, are we giving parents the information we need? We're so concerned on serving the student and so concerned on meeting their needs, which we should be. But we're not, but we're focusing so much there that we're missing the fact that parents need training and education and support too, which is why I love PTIs. I think they fulfill that huge need that we have. And I was telling Kendra about their transition program. I'm so excited to hear that that's being done because it's a huge need, and it's a need nationwide, probably I would even go venture to say worldwide. So definitely a huge thing, and something I encourage you to participate in, because you learn things like this. You understand the different services that are out there, understand those different, waiting lists and things you got to get on. And if waiting list is not a thing in Virginia, be happy it's not. And Texas, I have on here, and this is a true statement, Bob didn't get on the Medicaid waiver wait list until he was 18, but it takes 10 years to receive funding, so he won't have the service when he needs it the most. Our wait list actually in Texas is up to 17 years, believe it or not. It's so bad that our federal government is basically mad at Texas and trying to get our governor, of course, all of us are too, so I'm like, join the club, and I live here, but are trying to get them to fund the system because it's ridiculous. You should not be waiting 17 years for these important services. And so, but they can be a huge barrier here because we have families that they get their son or daughter on it when they're 18 years old. And so they have basically very little, if any, developmental disability services for years. And it's a huge problem, huge problem. And it's been one for decades, to be honest. So that's a huge issue too. So are we not just giving information, but are we making intelligent referrals? Are we really educating families about what's available, right? And what does this acronym mean? What does this organization do? Why do you need to call them? Why do you need to get on this wait list? Why is this website important? Information, right? That's what we need to be giving. A lack of parent training. A big challenge here is, this is an example we have had, actually, this has happened multiple times. We have parents that don't know that their financial holdings and income and retirement accounts and all that stuff can affect, and it depends on what it is, but can sometimes affect their child's ability to receive SSI or other adult services that are eligibility based. Parents don't know that, they don't receive much training, if any. I always tell people that, again, another reason I love PTI organizations like PT, because that's exactly what parents need, is they need that education, that information. How can they help their son or daughter or their children effectively without that information? So that's a huge part too. Again, not just focusing on the student's transition and the student's education, but the parent transition and the parent's education. Not enough prep time. Well, a lot of times, in Texas, it's age 14. And so at 14, they're required by law in our state here to specifically start addressing transition-related need at age 14. Some school districts address it much earlier, which is great, but required is 14. And the issue is, with a lot of students we've worked with, 4 years is just not enough. It's not enough. If the plan is to graduate them on time or even close to time at 19, let's say, 4 or 5 years is just not enough to address this transition skills deficits they're going to have. They're going to need far much more work than that. And so if we wait too late, then we're kind of running behind and we're trying to catch up and we're trying to throw all these interventions to get a student ready. And that can have a lot of issues in terms of effectiveness of interventions. And it's also just not enough time. You can't speed up time or speed up the clock, especially if the individual has a lot of significant skills deficits. It's just going to take longer than that. And so this can be also an issue too, where we just waited too long to start addressing those needs. Now, the results of these mistakes. So I'm a big believer of, if a system works, why fix it? But if it's not working, let's acknowledge that it's not working and let's do something about it. And that's where we are with transition, particularly with goals and with student planning. So the results of those mistakes, here's some interesting stats on workforce, if you're not familiar with. So in the United States, Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP, publishes pretty regularly. It's usually every couple months, every quarter-ish. Publishes disability work participation rates. And what that basically means is people with disabilities participating in the workforce in some capacity. And in their mind, participation is they're either have a job but they're unemployed, but actively looking for a job. Okay, that's participating in terms of the Department of Labor's brain and mindset. So one of the most recent stats, February 2021, basically what showed us was 17.9% of adults with disabilities were participating in the workforce, versus 61.8% for adults without disabilities. To simplify it, make it a little easier to understand, we're basically looking at it 17.9, we'll round up to 18, we'll even give generous and round it up to 20. So less than 2 in 10 people with disabilities are participating in the workforce. That's a horrible statistic, horrible. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it because I'm not gonna, it's a bad stat. One that we shouldn't be accepting of in a country like ours. That's crazy. The other piece that's not much more comforting is if we round that 61.8% to, let's say, 6 to 60%, then we're saying that a little bit over 6 of 10 people without disabilities are employed or participating in the workforce. And some of that makes sense if you consider our baby boomer population, retiring, all that. I get some of that, right? And I can get there. So some of that's not that unexpected. What really bothers me is it's a third. Literally, people with disabilities in the US are participating in the workforce at a third people without disabilities. And that's where I struggle. And that's where my brain is just like, no, that's not okay. Workforce participation rate of adults with ASD. So if we just focus on autism, well, it's one of the populations we specialize in, but certainly not the only people we work with. That one study was done that said 55.1% of young adults with autism held paying jobs their first 6 years out of high school. Now, that's actually way better, obviously, than the 17.9. So, we'll celebrate that, I guess. But here's the problem. That was the lowest percentage among the disability categories examined. So this study looked at longitudinal data from school surveys that were given to students who finished public school across the United States. And in that study, they found that 55.1% was actually the lowest out of all categories, lower than intellectual disabilities, lower than physical impairments, traumatic brain injury, you name it. And so that's a concern, right? So even looking just at autism, that's a huge concern. And that's only the first 6 years out of high school. We're not talking, 10 years, 20 years down the line. The other piece that we see a lot with folks on the spectrum is a lot of underemployment and unemployment. So an organization called Integrate works with large employers to create disability hiring programs. They're a great nonprofit. I definitely suggest you look them up. And with Integrate, they found that 85% of college graduates with ASD are unemployed. The big deal there is a lot of parents will tell us, well, look, we know if we just get them through college, things are going to get better, right? They got to be at the end. College is not the end. It's not the end of the line. It's a step on the journey, but it's not the end of the line. Really, the end of the line is independent living and employment. And so we have to keep that in mind. And a lot of times I think we kind of call finish, we call it early and say, oh, well, he graduated or she graduated, so it's great. Well, no, because especially if you're on the spectrum, that's not really much of a, you're talking 15% chance of getting a job. Well, that's not a good chance. Chronic underemployment of adults with ASD, many people with ASD, including those who are higher functioning, are in those lower wage jobs. Unfortunate about that is that perpetuates their dependence on SSI, government funding, on their family members. Maybe they're living with family, they're being taken care of by family, families contributing a lot financially and stress and causing stress to their own needs. And so that can be a huge issue as well. And we see that all the time where we've got clients who have master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, who are totally employable, but who are working in minimum wage jobs or entry-level jobs perpetually because they just don't have the social skills to really do the job that they should be doing or that they have the capacity to do. A huge, huge issue. Last one, about 79% of young adults with ASD work part-time, averaging $9.11 an hour. So that's an issue we have too, is not just unemployment, but underemployment. Okay, so underemployment is also an issue too, because again, it doesn't really move the needle. A great example one of my staff members gives is she said, if the student still has to live at home with their parents and their parents still have to pay their needs, then how is getting employed really change their life situation? And the answer is it's not. So it's not just about employment. It's about gainful, meaningful employment that actually meets the student's needs financially and also meets their educational capacity. That's what we're looking for. We're not just looking at checking a box and getting students a job. And I see that a lot too, right? I feel like people are like, well, they're employed. That's better than nothing. You want to bet? How much better than nothing? I'd venture to say it's not that great if you still have to rely on your parents for a lot of your basic needs. I don't see that as fulfilling. I don't think a lot of people would. So that's something we have to think about as well. One of the other pieces that come up is some of these other skills, and I'm not going to read them to you guys for time. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. So I don't want to dive too deep here. You can read, but self-advocacy, self-determination, motivation, right, is huge. I have seen individuals with significant disabilities, intellectually, physically, accomplish tremendous things just because of their motivation. They're so motivated to be successful. They're so motivated to get that job, keep that job, get that apartment, keep that apartment. That is such a motivating power for them that despite those true barriers that exist, they're going to push right through them because that's how motivated they are. And I love that. And I'll explain a little bit of my personal motivation in a second because that's a part of it. Accommodations on the school or on the job, disclosure. Are they fully disclosing their disability? Or are they just saying, hey, I have a disability or I need some support? Or are they giving diagnosis information? Are they going into the full spiel? Usually with employers, partial is fine. Soft skills, how do you relate to and interact with other people, for instance, social skills. And then hard skills. A lot of times our folks on the spectrum and even other disabilities, they're great at the hard skills. They're great at building the widget. They're great at, doing this. They're great at the actual physical task of the job. It's those soft skills where they really, really struggle. So thoughts on success. I really feel like motivation is such a key component here. So I didn't share this earlier, but I'll share with you now. I was diagnosed when I was 12 years old with Asperger's syndrome. Was now would be considered higher functioning autism, or depending on the category. And I'm 34 now, so it's been a fun 20 years. And in that time, I get asked the question all the time. Well, obviously you're successful. You've got an education. You're running a company. Why? How did you get there? To be honest, I don't know. I mean, who really does know why life turns out the way it does? All I'll say is this, I've always been motivated. Even if I've had struggles, if I've tripped, I've fallen, I've had problems, like everybody does, I have always been motivated. I liked what success felt like. I wanted to get there and I got there and I just kept pushing until I did. And I think that is something that, again, I see overcome a lot of other challenges and barriers in people's life. Someone who's motivated can literally move mountains. I've seen it. I believe it. So that's a big part of it. Ambitious goals. I've always had ambitious goals for myself. I've always pushed myself. I've had some people that have pushed me too. My parents have been wonderfully supportive. I have an amazing spouse who pushes me to do more and to be a better person. And I love that. And I appreciate that she does that for me. I appreciate my parents did that for me. But that's part of it too. Resilience, right? We all know life is not perfect, whether you have a disability or not. And so we're going to struggle. We are going to stumble. We are going to fail. It's just human nature, unfortunately. But what we also know is if we get back up or not is up to us. And that is that resilience. Confidence, not overly confident, but confident in what you're good at and confident in what you need help in. I always tell people, I am very confident that I am good at my job, but there are aspects, particularly like math and some other things that I'm just not great at. And I acknowledge I'm not great at them. So I'm confident in what I'm good at, and I'm very confident when I need help. And that's what's important. And the direction, right? That's why we do vocational evaluation. That's why I'm a rehab counselor. That's why I do what I do and why my company does what we do. a key point here too is parents really had to make that transition from advocate to advisor. So I see that over and over again where parents are still trying to be advocates for a 25-year-old, 30-year-old, 35-year-old. Even in the cases of guardianship, an individual needs to have a say. They have a voice, and that voice may not be a loud voice. It may not be a voice that is easy to understand or easy to figure out, but it's a voice and we need to appreciate it. And so I see that all the time of that individual that really needs to speak up. And the problem is they've never been given a chance to. I have parents tell my staff and I all the time when we're evaluating, well, he can't do that. And I'll ask, well, can he physically not do that? Like, has he tried and then failed? Well, no, but like, he just can't do that. And I'm like, okay, let me ask the question again. Has he tried and failed? Oh, no, but we just know he can't. And I was like, but how do you know? You've never let him try. You've never let her try. So sometimes we have to ask ourselves, can the individual not do something, or have they just never been given the opportunity to do so? And if they've never been given that opportunity, well, saying they can't do it is really not accurate because we don't know. So allowing that individual to be their own advocate, but then really transition to a parent being an advisor. And I tell people, a great example I give here, I don't care how old you are, disability or not, we all call our parents for advice sometimes. We all pick up the phone sometimes and say, hey, mom, dad, aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa, best friend, somebody, we need advice. We need help. We have to talk through things. That is a normal part of being human. That's a normal part of getting help from other people when we need it in rough times. That's great. Well, that's okay. A person with a disability should do that too. So my parents are still very much my advisors, but they're not my advocates because they don't need to be. I'm my own advocate. And that's something that I had to really go through and get training on and had to be done slowly over time. But I don't need an advocate. I need an advisor, sure, but I don't need an advocate. And that's really where we need to get with our individuals, is that we're really giving them that advice. We're backing them up. We're helping them get up when they fall, but we're not being their advocates for them. My study, looking at some of the correlations and things that I made. So as an individual, in my doctoral program, I really looked at specifics in terms of a correlational study. So I looked across different metrics. And what I found was for adults on the spectrum that were successfully employed 26 and older, there was one kind of connection, if you will. Not in relationships, not in characteristics, demographics, behavior, expectations. In my study, I found that parental expectations did have a meaningful impact with successful employment. For instance, a parent's positive expectations may increase the likelihood of their adult child achieving a successful employment outcome. I'm going to add a little piece there, all things being equal. And the reason I say that is because what the research showed was that just a parent having a higher, more positive expectation. For example, just a parent thinking that their son or daughter was going to get employed literally led to them having a higher chance of statistically getting employed. Now, that shouldn't surprise anybody who works at PT or anybody who works with parents or has been a special educator. I've seen it for decades. So that doesn't surprise me, but I wanted to prove it on paper because I think a lot of people, a lot of parents really get lost in the sight of, well, my son or daughter has this disability, or my son or daughter has these limitations or these barriers. Yes, but that mindset will not help them overcome those barriers. The mindset of, I still expect them to work, I still expect them to live independently or even semi-independently with some support from me, that's what's going to change that expectation. That expectation is going to change that outcome. So we really need to be careful that we're not kind of forecasting our own doom or our own defeat or our own individual's own defeat, where we're expecting the best. And yeah, that's life. You don't always reach what you expect. But just expecting it alone, based on research that I did, showed a lot of effect and showed some difference. So something we really want to look at. What about functioning level? I'm not going to go through this slide. I kind of talked about this before, but again, we have to be careful we don't overgeneralize functionation. I made a new word, functioning level, so it doesn't become something that we overvalue or undervalue, because I've seen it go both extremes for sure. So comprehensive vocational evaluation. The key I would tell you with a voc eval, and it doesn't matter if we do it, someone else does it, psychologist does it, regardless of who does it, the person needs to have training in actually placing people with disabilities in jobs, and they need to have training in actually evaluating people with disabilities for employment. But assuming all that's there, what is it? Well, it's a multi-battery assessment, meaning it's not one, right? We never just do one assessment and say, oh, that's it. Now, because this one assessment, everything's clear. No, It's a multi-battery assessment. So normally when we're working with our clients, we're doing, I would say, anywhere between 10 to 12 at minimum, different measures. Not because we just love testing them and we love giving them lots of different assessments. We do that because we want to see where everything lines up. We want to see what direction it's pointing in, because we can't just judge one thing alone. We really need to see where everything overlaps and where's the general direction it points to. And so these are examples of some of those assessments we do. You can do some of them individually. You can do some of them online. You can do some of them in person. You can do them one-on-one. You can do them in groups. But regardless, one of them alone is just not enough. You really need to look at a student holistically, and you're going to need more than one assessment to do that. Even a great assessment like the COPS, which I love, looks at interest, abilities, and values. It's by far one of my favorites out there. It even is limited. You can't do, because I'll give you a good example. Someone could be interested in something. They could have the ability to do it. They could value it. But what if their intellectual capacity gets in the way? What if their executive functioning gets in the way? What if their learning style causes problems? What if they have physical impairments? What if they physically can't move their fingers or can't move their hands fast? Well, if that job requires fast hand movement, which some jobs do, that's going to become an issue. So you can kind of see where I'm going with it. You can't just go with one thing. You have to look holistically as a student.